Hello, subscribers, and welcome back to this week's economics class in association and partnership with our friends at the Financial Times. This week's article, as you can see, is entitled Boris Johnson to announce £3 billion shake-up of England's bus network. Here's the article, and because, of course, you enjoy free access to the Financial Times through your school, I'll leave you to peruse that article at your own leisure. So let's get straight to the questions. We've got 4 questions this week, each becoming progressively more difficult and more in-depth, I suppose. So question 1, using a demand and supply diagram, analyse the effects of a, quote, 40% cut in local authority bus funding. So the first thing you need to do is obviously read your article and find that particular quote. As with last week's episode, I'll point you in the right direction, but I'm not going to annotate here and give you the answers. That's a job for you to do. So we've got our standard demand and supply diagram all nicely drawn and fully labelled up here. You need to think, of course, particularly in this instance, about supply. If there's a 40% cut in local authority funding, then what's going to happen to supply? And you then probably need to be thinking about, okay, will there be a shift of supply? If so, in which direction? And then as a consequence of that, what will happen to the price and the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied? So I'll say no more on that one, ladies and gentlemen. I'll leave that with you to have a little think about. Question 2, distinguish between nationalisation and privatisation. You'll know from your studies, I'm sure, about nationalisation, state ownership. You know about privatisation, that movement away from owned by the state and into the hands of the private sector. You'd probably be very familiar, I guess, with the advantages and disadvantages associated with such a movement. And you're probably also familiar with the work of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher during the 1980s, when this whole privatisation programme was really given that sort of rocket booster, and lots of industries were moved from the state sector into the private sector. I've copied across a chart from a previous Financial Times article, and you can see it's the UK public debt figures. Now, the reason that's of interest is, of course, because at the moment, the state is playing an increasingly dominant role within our economy and really stepping in and propping up all sorts of enterprises, businesses, which probably, under normal circumstances, given the recession that we're in at the moment, would probably have closed. So it's just an interesting thing to think about, the role of the state, the extent of the role of the state, and the extent of the role of the state, particularly at this moment in time. So it's kind of a little bit of a side issue, but something interesting for you to consider. Moving on, question 3. So now we're really getting into one of my favourite areas, actually, of the specification with regard to market structures and competition, etc. So question 3, the article refers to the 1980s deregulation of buses under Margaret Thatcher's Tory government, quote unquote. Find the quote in the article. Using a market structure diagram or diagrams, analyse the potential gains from deregulation. So this is something that I'm just looking at the moment with my Year 12 students. If you're in Year 13, the whole notion of using diagrams, plural, will probably be easier for you. But if you're in any way in the same boat as my Year 12s, maybe 1 or 2 diagrams is probably as far as you'd be able to take it at the moment. But in this instance, deregulation, removing regulations which prevent other operators from getting into this area of the market, and the whole notion of promoting competition within a marketplace. So here's a great diagram to sort of do that kind of comparison, where you're moving potentially from a nationalised, state-owned monopoly position, hopefully towards a more competitive market. Those of you who are well on in your studies of competition theory, you'll obviously as well, you'll be familiar with the idea of contestable markets. But in this particular diagram, what I have done is I've used the diagram which is very often used when you want to compare monopoly and perfect competition on one diagram. And you can see here we've got the price of the monopolist, P-mon, and the output of the monopolist, Q-mon. And then we've got the prices of the perfectly competitive firm and the output of the perfectly competitive firm at PPC and QPC respectively. You'll know that how we arrive at these positions, I'll not go into that in too much detail, but marginal cost equals marginal revenue gives us our profit maximizing level of output for the monopolist. And P equals MC and min ATC, of course, being the crucial characteristics for arriving at PPC and QPC respectively. So things that you want to think about here would be, initially, you might simply want to look at this in terms of a very basic demand and supply analysis, whereby we're removing regulations, allowing new firms to enter the market more easily, and therefore you want to be thinking again, as was the case with question 1, you want to be thinking about the movement of the supply curve. To take that on a little bit further, and maybe referencing this diagram that I've drawn here, you want to be thinking about price, you want to be thinking about output, but you also want to be thinking about the economic profit. Remember, we talk about economic profit different from accounting profit in economics, consumer surplus or consumer welfare, and then the efficiency is very, very important in the market that we refer to allocative efficiency, the extent to which it exists or does not, and productive efficiency, again, the extent to which that exists or does not. So again, I'll leave that with you, but certainly a number of things that you may wish to consider. And lastly, question 4. And again, another quote lifted from the article, close to the end, I think. A full double-decker bus can take as many as 75 private cars off the road. So the benefits of buses in cutting pollution and reducing traffic jams are as clear as daylight, close quote. Using a diagram, analyse the positive external benefits associated with increased usage of bus services. So obviously here we're thinking about market failure and positive externalities, particularly the negative externalities associated with pollution. So I'm sure you'll be aware of the fact that when we talk about transport economics, particularly cars which are using fossil fuels, that there's that whole idea and concept of negative externalities, third-party costs being imposed on somebody else and somebody who's not actually doing the driving of the car. So you're driving along, fumes pumping out the back of the car. You're doing the driving, but obviously you're imposing costs on a third party. In this instance, what we're looking at are the positive externalities associated with public transport, and the reasons why, for example, and for instance, the reason why we get this kind of allocative inefficiency when it comes to the consumption of goods which have these positive externalities associated with them. So here's your standard kind of positive consumption externality diagram. And we really want to be at the point where MSC equals MSB. But of course, private individuals only consider their own private benefit rather than the overwhelmingly greater social benefit, which is, of course, why MSB lies above MSB in this particular instance. We want to move away from QAI, the allocatively inefficient level, and we want to get to QAE, the allocatively efficient level. So really important to use those terms, allocatively efficient, allocatively inefficient. And you can see I've shaded here the DWL, the deadweight welfare loss area, again, something that you may wish to talk about with regard to that level of consumption at MPB, QAI being much less than really what society deems it necessary to be. Excuse me. So I think that's it, ladies and gentlemen, with regard to that. So lots that you can say about this particular diagram, and lots to talk about and lots to discuss. Okay, apologies, ladies and gents. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to seeing you again in next week's edition. Of course, if you've any messages, any questions, just fire me a message on YouTube and I'll do my very best to get back to you. Bye for now.